This is what's known as the entrance table for Ocarina of Time. It's basically a list of every location in the game, plus all the entrances or spawn points that exist within them. So for example, if an area has 6 ways in, it will show up on the list 6 times, once for every spawn point. When you travel from one location to the next, say from the graveyard to Kakariko Village, the game will store a set of values in its memory, followed by a brief loading sequence. It then pulls up the entrance table, checks which value matches which destination, and sends Link on his way, in this case to this spot in Kakariko Village. It's how older games like this create the illusion of a vast interconnected world, that all these different areas you explore fit together into a larger whole. Of course, in reality, most of these locations exist in their own self-contained space, a separate map from which the player can enter and exit other areas. Now, upon closer inspection of the entrance table, you may have noticed that some of the maps listed have rather unusual names, or names that don't seem to correspond with any in-game location we know of. On top of that, none of them have an entrance listed, nor do they show up as an entrance for other locations. This means that whatever these places are, they have no way in and no way out. So how do you access them? Well, technically you don't, at least not through conventional means. These are maps that were never meant to be seen, let alone played by anyone. No one except the developers, that is. They're basically leftovers from the development stage, testing grounds and beta maps which don't connect to any in-game location, and so they exist in a kind of limbo, hidden away in the forbidden corners of the game world. A dimension between dimensions, if you will. However, as evident from the footage on display, there are ways to visit these maps, and over the years their contents have been thoroughly explored and documented, particularly on websites like the Cutting Room Floor. Not only that, but as expected, Ocarina of Time is not unique in this regard. Turns out that practically every Zelda game has unused maps tucked away in its files somewhere. Some playable, others as models or sprite sheets only. They come in all shapes and sizes, from your typical test chamber filled with objects and enemies, beta versions of existing areas, to something straight out of the backrooms. Weird liminal spaces that seem to have no rhyme or reason to them. So today, let's pay a visit to some of these strange worlds and, see what we can find. Of course, there are a lot of them all across the series. Too many to count, honestly, so I'm only gonna cover a few of them. The ones I find the most intriguing, either because of their history, their implications, or because they're just straight up weird or unsettling. So without further ado, let's no-clip out of reality and into the unused maps of The Legend of Zelda. This first one might just be my favorite on the list, mainly because I never actually knew about it until I started doing research for this video. The mysterious Obake house from A Link to the Past. A Link to the Past has quite a few unused rooms scattered throughout its code, including the legendary Chris Houlihan room, which is technically not unused, but most people will never see it since it's basically a failsafe. Besides that, we have a bunch of unused dungeon rooms, beta versions of existing areas, some sort of kitchen, even an entire ship. Yes, apparently Link was supposed to board a ship at some point. But my favorite has to be the haunted house. So, allegedly, the game was supposed to feature a house plagued by some sort of poltergeist, and not exactly a friendly one. The house itself consists of 4 rooms total. A normal-looking living space, a room with an unusual floor tile and a single set of shelves, a chamber whose graphics are completely glitched out, and finally an empty space with the same weird floor texture as the shelf room. Now, we don't know if these rooms were actually meant to connect, or what they would have looked like if they actually finished it, but the color palette indicates that it's supposed to be dark inside. So how do we know it's a ghost house and not just a regular house with the lights out? Well, 2 reasons. First is another unused file that was found. It's a sprite sheet with a bunch of different objects like chairs, tables, beds, a Mario painting, stuff that's commonly found in A Link to the Past houses. However, what makes these assets different besides the color palette is that they have additional frames of animation, ones that are unique to this sprite sheet and not found in the game itself. If you put these frames in a sequence, it becomes apparent that the objects would have been thrown or moved in some way, even to the point of breaking or shattering in some cases. It's actually quite similar to the stone tiles that fly towards Link in some dungeons. There's a few unique objects as well, like an axe, forks, and knives, which will tumble and then embed themselves into something, presumably a wall or Link's face. And lastly, there's an unused animation of a window opening and closing, no doubt due to some paranormal activity as well. I actually thought it was a fireplace with a grill in front of it or something, but nope, it's a window. Now, the second reason we know the house is tied to some kind of ghost activity are the file names. The name of the object sprite sheet is polter.cgx, which is pretty on the nose, and the house itself is called OSR-Obake. An obake is a type of ghost from Japanese folklore. Pair that with the fact that they share the exact same color palette, and I think it's pretty conclusive that these two files were meant to go together. So yeah, apparently A Link to the Past was gonna feature some seriously haunted real estate at some point. Where this house was gonna be located is anyone's guess, but it's possible that at least part of the idea was carried over to Link's Awakening, which was the next game to be developed and does feature a house occupied by a spirit. Though thankfully this one doesn't try to hit you in the face with a piece of furniture. As open and seamless as the world of Breath of the Wild and its sequel are, even these games still utilize separate maps and loading screens on some occasions, most notably with the shrines, and in the case of Breath of the Wild, the divine beasts as well. They did a pretty good job at hiding this with the beasts, but the models you see flying or stomping around Hyrule and the map you actually explore are two separate things, hence why you can't just jump off and glide to a nearby landmark. In Tears of the Kingdom, the shrines still work the same way, but unlike the Divine Beasts, the story dungeons have now been fully integrated into the open world and can be accessed or exited without so much as a loading screen, the first time this has ever been done in the series. Now, that being said, there are in fact several beta maps for these locations hidden inside the game files, one for each of the 5 story dungeons plus Hyrule Castle. These maps are absolutely gigantic. In fact, they're basically copies of the entire overworld, sky and depths included, but with everything except the dungeon and the skybox removed. As for the dungeons themselves, they are fully explorable. Some of the treasures or enemy placements might be different, some puzzles are non-functional or pre-solved, there's no boss present in any of them, and some of the environmental effects are missing. Like the fire temple, for example, has a normal temperature, and the lightning temple is missing its darkness. However, structurally they're pretty much identical, so my guess is that each dungeon was simply developed on a separate map first, before they would be placed in the overworld, and from there they would make the final adjustments. Now, with that said, there is one noticeable outlier, the Spirit Temple. Known as Large Dungeon Soul in the game files, this one is very different from the dungeon we know. In fact, the Spirit Temple technically isn't even a dungeon, just a boss arena, and the actual dungeon part, if you can call it that, takes place at the Construct Factory. However, it seems the developers initially had something completely different in mind for the Spirit Temple. What little there is to see shows that it's more akin to an obstacle course, a straightforward path with enemies, hazards, and pitfalls blocking the way forward. A bit like the lead up to the Wind and Water Temple. There's even a few Zonai devices scattered about, as well as some other junk like iron poles, metal plates, and spike balls which for some reason are quivering, even though there's no wind or other force acting upon them. Now, obviously they didn't get very far with it, so we'll never know for sure what exactly they were going for. But I do suspect that there was supposed to be more to these platforms. For example, there's an oddly placed bombable wall, as well as an ice pillar, both of which block the way forward to the next platform. This doesn't make much sense since you can just get around them with ease, so my theory is that they were meant to become enclosed rooms and hallways at some point, not just platforms. You may also notice that the warp point you find here is different from the ones in the other dungeons. In fact, it's the one from Breath of the Wild, with the Sheikah text instead of the Zonai text, which to me indicates that this version of the Spirit Temple was likely abandoned pretty early in development. Also, and I could be wrong on this, but I don't seem to remember seeing a block like this one anywhere in the actual game. The texture looks very Zonai to me, but like the old Zonai style, not the new one we find on the islands and in the depths. So perhaps another early asset. Besides that, there's not much else to say about it. It's a cool piece of development history for sure, and it's fun to speculate what could have been. But as it stands, it's just a bunch of platforms floating in the void. A discarded relic like so many before. Next, let's go over some maps from the Wind Waker. As far as I'm aware, this game takes the cake for the most unused maps in the entire series. In fact, there are more test rooms than islands on the Great Sea, which is kind of insane. With that said, most of them are pretty stock. It's either your run-of-the-mill test chamber, rooms which experiment with fog, lighting, or weather effects, or beta maps of locations we know, like this early untextured version of Link's Oasis, or this beta version of Headstone Island, home of the Earth Temple, just to name a few. But then there are the odd ones out, like this one, which I'm sure needs no introduction. It's actually one of the more well-known beta maps in the series because of how strange it is. It's some kind of cathedral-looking building consisting of 4 rectangular rooms and a T-shaped hallway. Inside there's a fancy-looking door which unfortunately cannot be interacted with, a few wooden boxes, 2 platforms suspended by chains, and for some reason, pigs. Lots and lots of pigs. And these aren't just normal pigs either, but some kind of strange hybrid. See, there's 2 types of pig in the game. Small ones, which are light enough to run with while carrying them, and these big-ass mofos who weigh like 1,000,000 tons and can only be carried slowly. However, the ones inside the cathedral have the characteristics of both. They're small in size, but incredibly heavy, so much so that you can't run with them. At the same time, Link's throwing animation corresponds to that of a lightweight object, i.e. a small pig. It's very weird and I have no idea why it works this way. Another thing that stands out about this place are the oddly realistic textures. Needless to say, they don't fit at all with the simplistic art style of the Wind Waker. In fact, they look more like something you would find in Twilight Princess, a game which wouldn't even be developed until 4 years later. It goes without saying that there's a lot of unanswered questions, like why? What compelled them to model all of this? What were they testing? What could they possibly have tried to achieve here that wasn't possible on any of the other bajillion test maps? The only small lead we have is its location on the game disk and the file name, h_test. Apparently the cathedral is stored in the same location as the Hyrule Castle and Overworld maps, and so the theory is that the H might stand for Hyrule. If true, then it's possible that it's actually a scrapped location, not a test map, one that was supposed to be located somewhere in the Hyrule Castle area, perhaps one of these ruined buildings outside, or maybe even the Temple of Time. But that's all up in the air at this point. I mean, for all we know, it could just be an inside joke between the developers and nothing more. It's a mystery without an answer, and you know, maybe that's for the best. All hail the Temple of Pigs. Next is a map called I_sub-AN, sub referring to underground. It's a huge collection of nearly identical grottos, each with their own biome, puzzle mechanics, and enemies. Though they are small individually, many of them are actually quite functional and can be enjoyed as little micro-challenges if you ever get bored of playing regular Wind Waker. So what exactly makes this map stand out? Well, not much actually. Aside from this weird texture at the entrance of each grotto and maybe the overall size of the map, it's not all that different from the many other dozen or so test maps we know of. But there's one detail that does make it interesting, and that is that unlike all the other unused maps, this one makes an appearance in the actual game, not as an explorable space or as part of a glitch or anything, but in the form of a photograph. If you go to Lenzo's gallery on Windfall Island, you'll find a bunch of framed pictures taken by Lenzo himself during his travels. Things like the Forsaken Fortress, Outset Island, and even the Ghost Ship, all of which you can visit for yourself. That is, all except one. This forest-like area with a group of choo-choos in it does not exist anywhere in-game. People looked for it, they couldn't find it. And that's because it was taken inside Sub-AN, more specifically in this room with the green fog. I guess the developers simply needed a screenshot of a bunch of choo-choos and decided to take it here for the sake of convenience. But from an in-universe perspective, I guess we're supposed to assume that Lenzo himself clipped out of reality to take this photograph. Now granted, they did replace the screenshot in the HD version, but that's not gonna stop me from forming my own headcanon. In my mind, Lenzo is a no-clipper, which explains perfectly why he's so good at sneaking up on people. I mean, one moment he's downstairs and before you know it, bam, he's right behind you. Explain that, Neil deGrasse Tyson. Last up in the list of Wind Waker maps is another one most people know about, but it's just too weird not to include it. It's a room that was supposed to be located inside Tingle Tower, more specifically the top floor. Something that was clearly scrapped since there's no ladder or any other means to get up there. Now, we just talked about a map that's unused but does appear visually. However, in this case, it's the other way around. You can't see it, but it is mentioned in the game's lore, meaning its existence is technically canon, despite the fact that Link never actually sets foot in this place during his adventure. For those who aren't familiar with the Wind Waker, there's a place called the Nintendo Gallery, where things you've taken pictures of can be turned into little statues. These miniatures contain little bits of lore, mainly background information about whoever or whatever the statue represents. The statue of Knuckle, one of Tingle's younger brothers, mentions that he's the one who created Tingle Tower, and that the head of the tower is his art studio. Which of course makes you wonder, what would an art studio owned by the brother of a notorious scammer, slave driver, and ex-convict look like? Yeah, that seems about right. Honestly, there's not much to say about this place except there's a strange painting in the corner of what looks like Pepe the Frog, which for some reason is also used as a texture for the floor, walls and ceiling. There's a messed up table with 2 more paintings. Oh, and the windows line up with the 2 outside. More proof that it is supposed to be inside that spinning dome thingy. So what exactly is Knuckle trying to tell us with his mad scribbles? Who the hell knows? But if I ever stumbled on a place like this in real life, I would do a quick 180 and get out of there before the owner comes back. The Stone Tower Temple is considered by many to be one of the best dungeons not just in Majora's Mask, but the series as a whole, and a big part of the appeal lies in its unique central mechanic. About halfway through the dungeon, after obtaining the light arrows, you'll gain the ability to flip the entire structure upside down, which not only changes the way you navigate the interior, but also forces you to be extra observant about things you saw during the first half, like upside down chests, switches, doorways, and so on. Now, a quick peek behind the curtain reveals that you're not actually flipping the dungeon upside down. That's just an illusion. In truth, they are 2 completely separate maps, hence why you need to leave the dungeon first in order to invert it. Now, that being said, even though they are separate from each other, the rooms or sections inside each map do have a corresponding index number. It's a bit difficult to explain, but basically both maps are split up into segments, each of which with their own number assigned to them. And these segments will match their counterpart on the other map. So for example, section 1 inside the normal Stone Tower Temple corresponds to section 1 on the inverted map. There is, however, one little discrepancy. The inverted Stone Tower Temple contains several rooms that aren't accessible in the normal version, 3 to be exact. But in the game files, the amount of rooms listed for each map is the same, 12 for the normal map and 12 for the upside down map. I'm sure there's a technical reason for this, probably something with the index numbers or how it tracks your progression between maps, but whatever the case, it means that we have 3 files which are completely unused. So what's inside these files then? Well, on the N64 version, there's not much to see as it turns out. From what I understand, there is a model present, but it doesn't have any textures or collision data. For the most part anyway. There's one spot where you can land safely without falling through the level. This small black triangle. Not sure why, but that's just how it is. In the 3DS remake, it's a different story, however. Not only have these seemingly useless files been carried over, but for some reason here they do have collision data and can in fact be explored fully, albeit with some trial and error. The models still don't have any textures whatsoever, which makes almost everything appear grey and featureless. Naturally, this makes navigating this place quite difficult, but there are ways to get a sense of direction. First is by looking at the minimap, which is fully functional and will give you an indication of the room's shape as well as where all the doors are located, which would be impossible to know without it. The second method is to use a light source, like your fairy companion, Tattle, because despite the absence of textures, the geometry itself does interact with light. You're only able to see a few feet in front of you, but it does help to detect things in your surroundings, like walls and other obstacles, pitfalls, and even ladders. The only thing it doesn't reveal are the doors, which is where the minimap comes in. It's quite a trippy experience trying to navigate this maze with only a fairy to light the way. Though I will say that veterans of the Stone Tower Temple will likely catch on to the fact that the environments are not actually new. In fact, as far as I can tell, most, if not all of them, are direct copies of existing rooms, just with all the textures, objects, and enemies removed. Still, even with this knowledge in mind, finding your way around the place is still quite the challenge. Like I said, I don't know all the technical details, like why the rooms are the way they are, why the files differ between the original and the remake, or why they even need to exist in the first place. If anyone knows more about it, be sure to let me know down in the comments, as I'm always eager to learn more. If there's one Zelda game that's become synonymous with unused content, it would be Ocarina of Time. This game has been picked apart on every conceivable level, and as I already demonstrated in the intro, among the many discoveries made is a variety of unused maps as well, about 9 in total. One of these is called Item Testing Room, or Treasure Chest Room, depending on who you ask. It's basically a series of different colored rooms and hallways, most of which contain treasure chests and a bunch of different items strewn about, including a weird looking beta model of a heart container which isn't found anywhere else except here. Now, I haven't checked every single chest, but it seems almost every type of item in the game can be found here, even small keys, despite the fact that there are no locked doors anywhere on this map. Speaking of doors, while they can be opened like normal, they don't have a collision box, meaning you can just walk right through them. This will prevent the next room from loading in though, including the items and interactables within it, and remains invisible until you open the door the conventional way. The final room, which lies at the end of this green corridor, is one of the few that doesn't contain any items or chests. However, it does have something else in it. As you make your way through the hallway, you'll be able to hear the sound of what I assume are flying tiles, followed by a thud. You can even see debris clipping through the door on occasion. Now, normally these tiles don't activate until you enter the room proper, but for some reason these ones start flying while you're still out in the hallway, causing it to smash into the door, which definitely caught me off guard the first time it happened. The final anomaly can be found in the second room you enter, more specifically the wall to the right, which has a crawl space with a red carpet in front of it. The hole appears to lead to a dead end at first, but if you keep pushing forward through the darkness, you'll eventually reach an area outside the map's boundaries, or so it seems. If you try to explore further, you'll keep running into walls in every direction, indicating that there's some kind of geometry here that isn't being loaded in properly. One thing you can do is, if you hug the wall opposite of where you came in and press A repeatedly, you'll eventually enter another crawl space, though this one does lead to a dead end. There is some space to walk around in, but there's no additional holes, doors, or hallways beyond this point. So, as you've probably guessed, there's actually an invisible room here. The geometry is there, but the graphics aren't being loaded in, similar to some of the other rooms when you don't use the door correctly. That said, it is possible to render it visible using a GameShark code, and well, this is what it looks like. It's known as the Castle Room because of the wall textures, which are very similar to the ones at Hyrule Castle. There's no items here or chests, just an empty room with an oddly placed brick wall and a fake sky for some reason. It's one of the stranger rooms I've seen on these test maps, right up there with the Temple of Pigs and the art studio. Now with that said, obviously it's just a bunch of rooms and hallways, something they quickly slapped together to test item pickups and apparently some enemies as well. So it's not exactly a mystery what the purpose behind this place was. I mean, it's in the name no less. But it's the atmosphere that makes it interesting to me. Something just feels off while exploring this place, which is further amplified by the misplaced ambient sounds of nighttime in the outdoors. I mentioned the back rooms before, and that's exactly the kind of vibe I get here too. That sense of loneliness and unease that comes with liminal spaces like these. Like something just isn't quite right. It's actually quite fitting because the whole idea behind the backrooms is largely based on video game logic. A place where things and people end up when they no-clip out of reality, intentional or unintentional. And you know, from the perspective of those who live in this fictional world, that's basically what these unused maps are as well. Hidden spaces which exist somewhere among the normal world, but with no way to access them. Isolated, invisible, and yet very much real. And that is all for today. There's a bunch more unused maps to explore. In fact, I've only scratched the surface here, but you know, I had to stop it somewhere. If you liked it, let me know down in the comments and I'll consider making a part 2 in the future. I want to give a quick shout out to Lawnmeower and B Esquo. Getting access to some of these maps wasn't always easy, at least not for me, and they were both kind enough to help me out with some of the technical hurdles, which is very much appreciated. Lastly, a big thanks to my Patreons and channel members for their continued support. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you all next time.